first speaker, Dr. Gordon, is from the University of California at Davis. I've worked with Tom time and again concerning Fusarium. He's certainly an expert with this particular disease. He's very knowledgeable on Fusarium, not just on lettuce, but other crops as well. And this morning, he's going to be talking to us on factors influencing the severity of Fusarium wilt in California. And it's my deep pleasure to welcome him up here.
Okay, thank you, Mike, for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation. I think excellent idea to bring people together to talk about this problem. And as Mike said, my comments will be specifically related to the disease as it occurs in California, but given my position in the program, you will hear things that you have already heard from other speakers, which I think is good in the sense that it serves to reinforce some of the findings that we have in that we have seen similar things in different parts of the world. So as Steve Quakey mentioned this morning, we discovered the disease in California in 1990, and that was in the Central Valley, and growers likely managed the problem initially just by going to a field where the disease had not been seen yet. And over the years, the infestation naturally intensified, following growers around with soil, and about 12 years later, we detected it on the coast, and my guess is that it was carried over there in soil on equipment, although we certainly can't dismiss the possibility of seed being a carrier as well. So Steve mentioned the distribution of the disease on the coast, and I just wanted to point out one pattern that we noted. Although, as Steve said, it's fairly well distributed now. It became problematic much more quickly in the warmer areas, such as at the south end of the Salinas Valley, where temperatures are higher. And even though the first place we saw it was in the Pajaro Valley, where it's much cooler, the disease has been a lot slower to develop there. And this effect of temperature, which others have alluded to, we can demonstrate under controlled conditions very clearly. Where we grow the plants in controlled environment chamber under different conditions, the resistant type is unaffected, but varieties that are susceptible show significantly more severe disease, and this is on a rating scale of 1 to 4, with 1 being a healthy plant and 4 being a dead plant. So Mike has mentioned already the significance of planting date, which we presume is related to differences in temperature to which the crop is exposed. The question we were asking is whether or not we can see an effect based on differences in planting date of only 2 weeks. So in this experiment, we put the plants in on one of 3 different dates with 7 cultivars to see if that difference in planting date would correspond to a difference in development of disease. This shows the rating at 5 weeks after planting, again on the 1 to 4 scale. And what it shows is that for the varieties that are highly susceptible, there's little effect of planting date. There's a small difference there, but it's not large. And likewise for the varieties or the one variety that was resistant, not a big effect. But those that were intermediate in susceptibility, we see a significant difference in the development of disease. So here the blue corresponds to the first planting date and the other colors to the second and third. So if we look specifically at these 2, which we would regard as intermediate in susceptibility, there is a clear difference between the first planting date and the second and third, and that corresponds to a difference in temperature. If we look at the average temperature over that period, what we see is the difference is really quite small. So that's the average temperature plants were exposed to during the first planting, and this for the second planting. But it's more revealing to look at the temperature on a daily basis. And this graph shows the direction and extent of the differences between the first and the second planting date, with this direction representing a higher temperature during the first than the second planting. And what it shows is that beginning at 3 weeks after planting, we had much higher temperatures in the first planting than in the second. So it seems that that difference at that time point in the growth of the crop was sufficient to result in a significant difference in the development of disease. And I would submit that the effect that we saw in this experiment understates the potential impact of planting date, because This experiment was done in a field with a very high level of inoculum, over 500 colony-forming units per gram. And that's much higher than what we typically see in production fields in California, where the range is much more likely in the range of 100 to 150 propagules per gram of soil. So even with inoculum levels many times higher than that, we see a significant benefit of planting date, which we attribute to differences in prevailing temperature during the growth of the crop. The effect of temperature is also important with respect to screening for resistance. And what you see here is disease severity for 9 lettuce cultivars, and again on a scale of 1 to 4, maintained in a controlled environment chamber under moderate temperature conditions, 23-18 Celsius day-night temperatures. If we look at the same 9 cultivars but incubate them at a warmer temperature, then we can see clear differences. So by doing the test at higher temperature, we do a much better job of resolving differences in susceptibility. Resistance is certainly the long-range and most enduring solution to the problem of Fusarium wilt in this and any other crop. But we always have to be mindful of inoculum levels in soil because it can influence the development of disease, particularly in varieties that are only intermediate in resistance. So we know, and Mike referred to the data already, that if we fallow a field, that the population of the pathogen will decline. And this is the graph that Mike showed. And this is very similar to what we see for other Fusarium wilt pathogens. The population will certainly decline if the fungus is not given an opportunity to grow and reproduce on a substrate, residue, or plant roots. So it endures, but only at lower levels, and based on this data, we suggest a half-life of about 6 months. So 6 months in the absence of an opportunity to grow and reproduce, we would expect the inoculum level to drop by about half. So the question is, can we achieve this in the context of crop rotation? Rather than fallowing the field, we're just going to grow a crop that is not susceptible to the pathogen. We know that this fungus will colonize the roots of any crop, and we see this with all Fusarium wilt pathogens, all those that we have studied. The fungus is indifferent to what the roots are attached to. If there are plant roots, it can colonize them. But the colonization is generally quite limited. It will get into the root cortex and not grow beyond that point. And because roots explore a relatively small volume of the soil, this will have a negligible impact on the persistence of the pathogen in soil, provided that the extent of colonization is limited. So that is the question we need to ask about rotation crops. How extensively are they colonized by the Fusarium wilt pathogen? And the data I'm showing you here provides an estimate of pathogen biomass based on colony-forming units per gram of cortical tissue. So we're just looking at the outer layer of root tissue. And what it shows is that we do get some development on these crops, cauliflower, broccoli, and spinach, but only to a limited extent, and no reason to choose between them based on these differences, which we did not find to be significant. Where we do see a difference is if we look at colonization of the vascular stele. So this would be the inner core of the root, where we would expect the pathogen to be because it gets into the xylem, but often we do not find that fungi that are not pathogenic will colonize that extensively. And what we saw here was that spinach was the exception. No colonization of cauliflower, very limited in the case of broccoli, but significantly higher levels in the vascular stele of spinach. So on that basis, we can't say that spinach poses a significant risk, but we certainly can say that cauliflower and broccoli would be better choices of rotation crops based on the data that we have. Of more concern really than rotation crops is resistant cultivars of lettuce. What we see here is a ranking of cultivars based on disease severity. All of those that are close to 1 we would regard as resistant, highly resistant in most cases. But that's based on evaluation of what's above the ground. So we see a crop that looks like this, and we would rate that as healthy and hence resistant. But what we find is that if you look below ground at the roots, often those crops are infected and to very different degrees. So that's what I'm referring to as a cryptic infection. It's cryptic because you don't see it if you're only looking at the above ground parts of the plant. But below ground, what we see is that in some of the cultivars that show no symptoms above ground, colonization of the taproot is extensive. All the discoloration that you see here is the result of the growth of the pathogen. So, not surprisingly, that means great potential for an increase in inoculum when you are growing a resistant cultivar. And somewhat counterintuitively, in fact, there's a much greater risk with a resistant than with a susceptible cultivar. And the reason for that is that the susceptible cultivars tend to die fairly quickly, whereas the resistant cultivar grows to maturity, providing a much greater resource for the pathogen to grow. So we see a much greater risk of increasing the population of the pathogen when we are growing a resistant cultivar than one that is susceptible. So with respect to management, our current recommendations include, firstly, knowing the history of the field. And as Steve mentioned in his talk, it's important to have proper diagnosis to know what the cause of the problem was. And if it's a field where Fusarium wilt has been a problem, then it's obviously appropriate to use the most resistant variety available. And I want to emphasize here that although for crisphead cultivars we don't have what we consider truly resistant varieties, there are significant differences in susceptibility, and those can be important where the inoculum levels are relatively low. So although they wouldn't hold up to the most severe disease pressure, that level of resistance may still be useful depending on the inoculum level in the soil and the prevailing temperature, which gets to the other point, and as you have heard in other presentations, temperature has a very significant effect on development of disease. So it's always a greater risk when you are growing lettuce in the warmest planting windows, and where you have the option, it certainly makes sense to avoid the most susceptible cultivars during the warmest part of the year. And as I mentioned, I think it's important to keep in mind that if you're growing a resistant variety and you see no symptoms, it doesn't necessarily mean the pathogen is not present and possibly increasing. And you can get a good clue about that by looking at the roots, pulling up plants, and seeing if any of them show discolored taproots. And as Steve mentioned earlier, obviously you need proper diagnosis to ensure that it's Fusarium, but if you see discoloration in the roots, that would certainly be an indication that it was a possibility. Based on the data that we have, we consider broccoli and cauliflower to be good rotation crops, spinach perhaps less so. And finally, to keep in mind that inoculum can be moved with soil. And I think this is something that anybody who has worked on a soil-borne pathogen is aware of. It's hard. In fact, it's not really possible to quantify the nature of the risk, or for that matter, to quantify the benefit of proper sanitation. But I think anybody who's worked on these diseases would agree that it certainly is a good practice to the extent that it's possible to not move soil and equipment between fields. And as a general practice, because you may not see symptoms of the disease, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the fungus is not present. So I'd like to point out that I've reached the end of my talk, and Barry hasn't even stood up yet. So I wanted also to thank the California Leafy Greens Research Program for their support of our work, and also to note that, contrary to what you may have heard, we do have water in California, and there it is right there. Thank you for your attention.